Hey guys, this is Tolly and welcome to Let's Build a JRPG Part 16. First off, start of this stream, if you guys didn't see Discord about, a month ago or so, I posted a new channel in there, which is DevBlog, which had a small description, and I'll let you go read it if you really are interested, kind of explaining the kind of change in pace with some of this stuff with the JRPG. The broad summary, though, is basically that my girlfriend Drixie has taken a more active role in development. She's started to learn more about digital art, has always done painting, and is helping me with some of this art stuff. And we've kind of made a decision together that we're going to work towards trying to make a full JRPG, or something that may take us years, but that's the goal. So more detail in Discord, a little bit more anyways. But for now, I'm going to jump into some stuff that I've been doing off camera. In between the last stream and this one, there has been some work that I've done. Some things that I either thought weren't super interesting or I just wanted to get to and I didn't necessarily have enough time to stream. The first and kind of most important thing for me was that loading into specific random encounters is neat for actual gameplay, but for testing purposes, it can be a bit difficult to get into the specific encounter that I need to see. So I might want to test a certain set of battle enemies or a certain set of scenarios or abilities, and to do that it's much easier if I can go in and actually select. Up until now, when we ran the battle, it would just generate a random encounter for us. But I built this simple debug menu that basically builds out a list of the zones, builds out the list of the encounters in those zones, and then I can click on each of those encounters and it will show me the monsters in that encounter. And then I can either select a random encounter and this will select it based off the current selected zone, or I can select the selected encounter. So if I want to do a quick battle where I just want to test, say, the UI for the end screen, which is another thing I've done, I can go into the cactus battle specifically, and we can jump in here, we can do an attack on this cactus guy, do a couple hits on him, and we get this new UI thing, which is the other thing that I've worked on. So in building that kind of UI to get us in and out of battles, the main reason I was doing that was that I wanted to start getting into this idea of having kind of victories and characters actually leveling up. We had the team management system set up in a previous stream, but we didn't really have a way of progressing. There wasn't really the concept of stats for characters. We had kind of been hard coding basically the speed value, and every other value was just set to a random number inside of the unit factory. But I wanted to have that coming in from design data. So if we bring up the game data page, this is the stuff we've been working on since the beginning. We can show in the character section. In here, it used to just be the ID of the character's name, which prefab to load with them. There's this new concept called companion, but then the thing I want to talk about first is stats, and I've now added all of these stats values into this section. And then of course at the end we still have what abilities that character knows. So the stats section basically has a base stat, and then it has progressive stats. So whenever a character level ups, we level up. So whenever a character gains a level, they will increase their stats based off of these values. So a knight will increase their attack faster than they'll increase their magic attack, for example. These are not final values. These are more just test ones put in here kind of to let some of the numbers start to feel kind of right. Honestly, they're still pretty far off. But we have these stats now coming in from the design data. When a battle ends, we can actually level the characters up by awarding them experience, and when a character gains experience, we can increase those stats. So all of that's happening in the back end, and inside of the global scene, we have the global managers, we have the backend manager, which is keeping track of each of these characters and holding on to these stats, and as they level up, we are actually seeing those stats grow. So that's kind of all happening now. We can't see the rank offhand. I think the rank might be built into here, so we can see the current rank based off of these values. But we can also see that stuff is actually working by going in, doing the cactus encounter again, and then when we win this one, well, number one, we'll notice the HP is going up for the characters. We'll also notice that their attack damage is going up, but also here we can see the experience stayed, and then we can gain new amounts of experience, and the characters go up to level 3. Cool, rad, awesome, super neat. So that's kind of that base concept. Let's see. So I can hit enter and I can get back to this menu, and from here I can, well, okay, so that's basically it. There's not much really else to say there. We can take a quick look into the source tree for this stuff. I don't want to go through every file per se, but let's see, what did I do? I hooked up the debugger, added stats growth, added the ranks loading, added the experience rewarding, and the reward screen to show the progression of the units and the experience. So yeah, that basically covers that commit. And then the next one after that was the concept of companions. So adding a companion unit to the battle scene. There was a known bug at commit, which I still have to fix, which is going to be the next part of this stream, honestly. All right, so let's quickly dive into this a little bit, just broad strokes. The way that this encounter manager is working is pretty straightforward. We built up some buttons, a simple button object using the addressables systems that we were using for loading before. Let's go back into normal view instead of debug view. Load up Visual Studio. And in here, preparing solution. So basically this thing has the transforms for the contents, which is where we will stick the buttons. On a knit, it grabs all of the zone data. It will addressable instantiate the button, the zone button, and it will on load of that object, that button, it will populate it with the text for that zone data's debug ID. And it will also add a listener that on click, we will update the zone selection. Zone selection will change the color of the text and then update the zone list, which basically does the same kind of thing that the first one did, which is now we're going to go through all of the encounter data based off of the encounter ID that you selected in the first one, and we're going to load up a bunch of zone button debug buttons, but this time we're going to load them up with a bunch of encounter data, and this time on that button press we'll update the encounter selection. The encounter selection will then update the enemy list, and basically does the exact same thing. The button for this is it's not a button, it's a panel for the monster information, and so this is a different prefab, but we instantiate that, and on load of that panel, then we will populate basically just the monster name into the text, and that's primarily it. That's the gut of it. And just to show it again, all of that code, or not even all that code, but basically that simple, like when we click this, load this, and when we click this, load this, is just working off of showing all of that design data for us. And that's primarily it. In terms of the stats stuff, a lot of that is kind of taken still from the Liquidfire blog stuff, similar to how stats are described in some of that. Bring up that page real fast, so if anyone wants to dig into that information, they can. Again, kind of just giving more of a cursory explanation of this stuff, and then we're going to dive into something and kind of work through it. So in here, kind of just following similar to how stats are kind of derived here. The only main differences in this blog series, there's the concept of jobs and employing jobs. We kind of left some of that to the wayside. If you want more detail on some of how this was set up, some of how we brought in this new design data, and how the actual leveling up is going, I can go over that. If there's requests in the comments, then we'll do a separate video kind of covering some of that content. But for now, let's just assume that we have content for these characters to have stats on them. The stats are coming in from the design data. The characters can level up and we can increase those stats. And then we built a little menu in order to get into specific encounters. That's the gist of it. The other big thing we did, which we can take a look at more finely detailed inside of Hack and Plan, is... okay, so let's bring this in. So much information. So started using basically a real tracking board for tracking content. Now that Drixie's helping with some of this stuff, it makes less sense to do it inside of game data. We used to have a backlog in here, which is where I was trying to keep track of all this information. And this is great when I'm trying to focus on small little things. Not all of this has been transferred over to the backlog in this system, but this system is allowing us to track things more in like a design model structure. So we can have something like the combat mechanics, and here are some of the mechanics that I need to work on. And inside of these mechanics, there's tasks inside of them. And the work items for this one have all been completed. So it doesn't show them anymore. Huh. I don't think I realized that once the work items are oh, because I have it on open. Okay, so here we can see the work items that this thing had, and they're all complete. And then here's some more that I'm still working on. And then I'm still filling in the backlog, pretty basic so far, but we're working our way through that. But right now for the August sprint this month, where we're at is essentially I did off camera this concept of a character. So let's see, did I do a good description on what the combat system was in here? So set up the player units to load with a companion. The hero should have base abilities, but the companion should grant extra abilities. Both characters should appear on screen, one in front of the other, and order depending on which abilities was used last. Each should have their own stats, including own HP. Whichever character is in front should take the hits. These were the tasks I kind of broke out for what I would need to do in order to get that description up and running, essentially. And so those tasks were building out the design data, which in the end this became not a task because I decided that I could actually use the design data that we had already built for characters for the companions. So basically a companion is just a character that you assign to another unit. So these ones right now load in with this companion. Some of this architecture I still like to change as we move forward. I think that there maybe shouldn't be the definition of who's equipped to who inside of this design data. I think that maybe there should be like a companion manager and maybe have some way of swapping them. Right now I'm thinking that each character would only have a single companion through the experience of the game, but I want to build it with the flexibility that if we find that it's too rigid, that we could swap out different companions as we play through. Potentially swapping companions might be how we unlock new abilities or gain access to new things. Maybe we level up a specific companion, and once that companion, we've learned all their abilities, we move on. Like it could be like a sub job system but based around pets. Not sure. Still brainstorming and workshopping our way through some of that stuff. But I wanted to try getting this up and running and getting this concept into the game so that we can start playing with it. So loaded up the character. Once we had the character loaded up, then we were able to have the character load on start. Pretty straightforward, pretty basic. Just make sure that we're actually bringing in the models. Then we had to set up the class to be run through the unit factory so that we would actually build a unit with stats and with HP and everything else the same way we do for all of our heroes. Again, using the same hero logic, so that wasn't too bad. And then we wrote a little bit of logic to be able to add the ability list of the companion to the command window, and got it set up so that when we use an ability, it swaps the character order based on whoever's ability was last used. Right now it's not part of the ability sequence, but we've got it working in a basic way. And then I've changed the hit logic so the character in front is the one who gets calculated for damage. Lost my chat windows. Hello, Kazikish. I'm not sure when that chat was from. I need to try and keep those chat windows up as I move so many menus around. I feel like I need a third monitor just for chat now that we're trying to do code stuff. For streaming a game, 2 windows was enough. For trying to talk about code stuff and stream, I feel like I need a third monitor. All right, so yeah, so this is the characters attacking. We can see here that if I go into this magic attack, This magic attack is darkened. This is my debug way of showing that this is a companion ability. This ability comes from the companion, and I can use the companion's ability, which causes them to swap. Now the attack was based off of this character, not off of this character. And then, but each of them take the same turn order. So we don't take turn order activations for the golems. Instead, each of the heroes take a turn, but you can choose whether you attack with the golem or with the main character. And whoever you attack with determines who will be vulnerable to attacks from the enemy. But we have a couple problems, which you may have noticed when we were in Hack and Plan. Right now, the thing that I want to tackle right this moment is that we have a bug. So we built our system on a bit of a logical fallacy. There was a bit of a thing that we built everything around that now that I see it, I'm like, how did I miss this? This is such a bad thing. But I just didn't see it. And what we didn't notice was that we were using unit ID to fetch characters in combat, but the unit ID is not a unique ID in combat. A unit ID for us in our game is the identifiable name for this character. So we can say that we have a main character knight, we have a main character, or main character 2, main character 3, main character 4, and then we have companion golem. But because we actually have 4 golems in the scene, when I attacked with that first attack, it was actually with this archer. But because our system right now, when we say, hey, I'm going to use my attack and I'm going to attack with this ability, our sequence system loads it up such that that is kept track of as the unit. So we can see that by going into the combat character manager. Get random target is not the call, but get unit. So in get unit, which is used everywhere, we pass in a character ID, and this character ID is based off of the is the unit ID essentially. There's some misnaming we have in here, but we say, hey, the attacker. We have this concept of a sequence, and we say the sequence is the attacker and the targets, and this attacker value is set here. When we target an enemy with our target selection UI state, when we actually click to attack a unit, we say, hey, the attacker is based off of the current unit.md, and the current unit is whoever's currently activating. And so we can say, hey, this is the current unit we want that we're going to have attacking. And this current unit I've now modified to actually be set based off of the ability. So the when we say ability button was pressed, we send out not only the ability ID like we used to, we now send out the unit as well. So we say, hey, we used fire attack, and it was a fire attack coming from this unit. And so that's cool. So now we can say, all right, well, the unit that used fire was a golem. So that we're going to say the current unit MID is going to be golem. Get me that unit. I'm going to grab his animator, set him to relax, which he doesn't have animations right now, so that doesn't do anything. But we can do current unit.md is the attacker. But when we go to use this attack value, we'll actually just fetch the attacker from the combat manager. But the combat manager just searches through the units and finds the first one that has the character ID equal to it. But because we have 4 golems, it just finds the first one. So it doesn't matter which character or which golem I attack with, I'm always going to just swap with the first guy because they're all golems. None of them know any different. So we're always just finding this golem. He's the first one in the list, and we're going to check to see if he's in front. And if he's not in front, we swap him. And this one is always the one doing the attacking. And this is actually a bug that we've had for a while. There was a period of time where if we jump back to the select scene, oh, the beauty of the select scene. If we jump in here and take a look at a battle in which we have 2 monsters with the same ID, so if we look at Ghost, I had noticed that sometimes when I was targeting ghosts and attacking, it was attacking the top one, but if I attacked the bottom one, it would still sometimes attack the top one. And it wasn't seeming to be consistent, but there seemed to be something off. I think this is the same bug. I think that somehow this is causing the targeting to be messed up. So how do we fix this? Well, I think the most obvious thing would be, instead of using inside of this unit an ID that is coming from the character data, instead of creating a unit and using the character ID, or in the monster's case, so we did plan for this with the monsters. Okay, I'm wrong. It's not the same thing with the monsters. The monster's ID is coming in from its index. So we were smart enough on the monster side to write code that checks the index. And this index increments based off the initialize. So we were smart enough to write that code. Okay. So again, some of my assumptions were incorrect. I assumed that these were doing things the same way. So if I do have a bug with targeting, it may be related to the UI positioning. So maybe the buttons are getting flipped in the UI. Regardless, we still have this problem in here. So for the units, we might want to do the same thing. So I guess the monsters don't have this problem. I just thought they did. All right. But we were smart enough that with the monster stuff, and maybe we saw this bug and fixed it already, but we would initialize them with the index, and the index would get incremented each time we ran the monsters. So there would be a monster 0, monster 1, a monster 2, monster 3. The trick with this is I think the characters, we want to do the same thing. And I also don't think we want to reset this ID in between each monster, because, or each unit that we spawn, because this ID should be unique for this combat. So for this combat, when I say, hey, grab me unit 5, I'm not talking about design data. I'm not saying, hey, I want to go find unit 5 from this design data. I'm saying for this combat, there should be someone who is specifically 5. I have said that I'm targeting 5. I've said that I am 5. The current unit is 5. And that's the value that we should be using as the unique identifier. So we set each of these to have a number based off of their load, and that should be fine. That's at least unique for this combat. If we ever decide to have monsters coming in not at the beginning, so if we have monsters that spawn other monsters or any kind of mechanic, this index should probably be put into a global manager, or should be, well, it's in a character loading manager, so this thing might need to be reevaluated, but this index might want to be at the higher level of a private value, not just in this function, so that as we add more units, that index is always growing. For now, though, I think what I want to do is I just want to have this index that we use for monsters also be used for characters as well. So the characters should also have an index value. And this should work out the same way. We shouldn't have to change too much here. We just need to add an int index here. We need to set this index value that we were already setting before. Let's add it in the same way. And then here, when we pass in this index here for monsters, we should do the same thing for creating a unit. And so this should now come in with a index. Okay. And then this index should be used as the character ID. Now, the one thing we need to be sure on is this ID ever used to fetch design data? Do we ever say, hey, this ID, I expect it to be this value? And we want to, well, do we ever ask our data store to say, hey, get me the character name for ID main character 1? So do we ever write code like that? Because if we do, then we're going to need to add another ID value, which will be design data ID and combat ID. And in fact, I kind of want to rename this value as well. Some cool techniques I've picked up recently is if you do double click Control R twice, then it'll let you rename. I think you can do that just by right clicking as well, but I think it's cooler if I do it with the command. Although for streams, it might be more valuable to honestly show the right click and rename. So there's 16 references across 6 files. So we're going to rename this to combat ID. Okay. And then if we go actually look here, this is used for the targets. That's fine. I know that the target data is just being used to retrieve the unit from combat character. This is setting that ID and then using that ID to set the attacker. Okay. This is being used to find it in the get. This is used to get the unit, which is the exact same thing here. The get animator is the same thing as the get character, but it just returns the animator component instead of the unit component. This is inside of the companion stuff. Okay. No. It looks like we did use this combat ID just as a combat ID. It was never used to fetch design data. So if we do need the ID for a character to get the design data at some point in a battle, we can always re-add it, but at this point we don't need to. I think that this is fine. And again, for clarity, I'm going to just quickly do this. I could have done the rename thing, but I don't think I need to. It's just one spot. Cool. Okay, so this is now a combat ID. There was a second way that we could fix this. The other way that we can go about fixing this, and I think I want to put in both fixes because this is actually better in some ways, is that when we pass in this attacker into this ability sequence, this holds an integer. Technically, we don't have to pass in an integer because right now we're passing in the integer for the attacker, and then at a later time we do a get animator on that, or we do get unit, which in this case is just going through and doing a search to find it in this for loop. This is an unnecessary loop. We don't have to do this. Instead, we could just directly store the unit because we already have the unit when we set this attacker value. We're going current unit we're doing current unit, which is a unit value dot combat ID. So we could just do this instead. And the reason that I didn't do this when we were first coding this is for some reason in my head, I thought that this would be copying the whole object. So when you set something in memory, sometimes you got to be careful of accidentally setting a whole class in memory and holding onto that whole data chunk. And I don't know how big this unit might get in the future. But in Unity, in this specific situation, we're not actually holding the entire chest of information. We're not making a copy of the unit and sticking it into this variable. Instead, we're referencing it. So we're saying, hey, I'm going to say that this ability ID has an M unit, and Unity is technically going to make this a reference. So it's going to reference this mono behavior that is attached to some object. So it'll really be a memory address that we're saving. And I could be wrong about the exact specifics, but conceptually, we're kind of saving an address more so than saving the whole object. So this is actually a fine thing to do, but I didn't do it originally, and I did it as an integer because I thought I was saving space. That I thought I was not carrying as much like luggage around, but in reality, I can just do this, and it's just setting a locker ID for where I've stored my luggage. So it's just as easy as storing an int. Yeah, conceptually. I could be wrong on the finer details of this, but let's say that I'm right. So we can now have ability info take in a unit and then set that unit here. And then we just have to find all the references to this unit. Here, this is fine. That's fine. So here, instead of this, we can do unit, and we can pass this unit in here. This attacker needs to be a unit. Targets will also need to be units. This target's value was getting random targets using this function, and this was returning the ID, but now we can just return just this. This should be a unit, and this should be a unit. And we need to, the result value that we're returning needs to be a list of units. It needs to return a unit, and then we get a random target ID from this list that we stored here, and now we're returning a unit value. Also, while we're here, we can look and see how we're handling the fact that now we have companions and units. We added a new class called row, and inside of row, you can either be, you can have a current row position. This is an enum that is just front or back. And if I set my position and my new position is equal to front, then it's -5. I actually want to have, this isn't quite working. It's a little bug still. I'm going to write a to-do actually, so that if I'm ever looking through the code base, I might find this and actually fix this properly. We want to use the actual starting position for the X value instead of just assuming it. This assumes that the X value is 0, and we will either be negative 0.5. This is actually forward because of the way the scene is built, but we'll either be forward or we'll be back by this values, because technically the characters start on the right hand side, and so negative is going left to go forward, and going positive pushes them more future. The thing, I take my word for it. I'm not gonna. Okay. Characters exist in the scene. We have some monsters. We have some space between. We have a unit, and we have a companion behind them. And then in this scenario, the values, this is negative on the timeline and this is positive on the timeline. And so if we want to move a character back, then we add to their position. And if we want to move them forward, we negative their position to bring them forward. For our perspective, because we consider front to be in front facing the enemy and back to be behind the other unit facing the enemy. But from the actual coordinate system, negative is forward and positive is back. Okay, cool. So this is how we're kind of setting that back and forth position. And this is just setting it, but this actually gets used on the ability. It just seems like a natural tangent. I'm just going to walk off a little bit here. We also have a swap row positions. So inside of the companion class, which is another companion, a new class that we added with the companion, which basically just stores a unit, which is its pair. Every character will have, every hero will have a companion class, and inside of it, it will reference their companion. So a hero will reference the golem, and the golem will reference the hero. And then when we call swap positions, we basically just say, hey, whatever the companion's current position is, then we save it as temp. We set the companion's position to whatever this character's row was, and then we set whatever this character's row to that temp, which was the companion's old. So just a little swappy swap to be, all right, now the golem and the hero switch places. And where this is done is just simply, if when we do an attack, if the unit that we attack with is row is in the back, then we swap positions. So whoever the attacker is, if it was the golem and we used a golem ability, so the attacker would be the golem. If he was in the back, swap him to the front. If we attacked with the hero and say the hero was already in the front, he wouldn't be in the back, so we don't swap. Easy peasy. All right, and look, we got ourselves back to a spot where we actually need to update things. So this is getting unit. So to get back on track, we are modifying all of this attacker stuff to not be an ID, but instead be a unit class. So we can just do that. That works. And we should be able to check the error list to find any other problem areas. I assume there's going to be a lot. So here we no longer need to get the unit. Instead, we just have a reference, so we can just get its game object. Same thing here. Just get its transform. This is the targets. This is expecting ints, but now we instead are just going to have the target, which again means we don't have to get it from, we're saving all of this time having to loop through this stuff, and instead we just have the reference. Don't need that bracket. Okay. Getting close. We're just removing all of this. Now this one is somewhat of a shame because I liked having this get animator wrapper, but in this situation now we can do get component because we already have a reference. And we can just get the animator. This value. Okay. Same thing down here. Instead of get animator, we can just get component animator. Something that runs through my head a lot is whether or not we should just have references to all the components on the unit, because the unit's kind of the root, and it might save a little bit of time if the unit just had references to every other component. That way we could just grab it. But I guess that's what this does. This is technically just getting it. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to get into it. So this is getting a list of units now. Unit. A list of units. These are my targets. We set my targets to my targets. Yep. That's all working. Here we were getting the unit and grabbing its display name for debug purposes. And here we were grabbing the unit in order to get if it has a knocked out effect. Oh, missed this one over here. This is getting who we are attacking from the target 0. A lot of our code still assumes that we only have one target. And then here, arg0 in this situation. That's because here we assume that it's a list. Now, the question is when we send this function, how does this get set? This gets set by adding an observer for target button press, which I believe is a value. So where does that value get stored? Target button press. Who calls this function? Here, post notification. This also needs to be changed. This is the follow-up because this sends in that information of the targets. To that, we were modifying the receiver, but we also need to modify the send. Cool. And that should be that. Now there could be another spot like this where if we didn't catch the receiver or the send code as well, we might be in trouble. But overall, that should be working. Okay. Just making sure we're still live on the internets. Couple lurkers today. All right. So, I hope some of that made sense. But we've done two things here. To fix the bug where we were swapping the wrong golem, we made it so instead of setting all of the characters' IDs to be their design data ID, instead we give each thing we load into the scene its own unique combat ID, which is the order that it was loaded. And we also made it so that our ability sequence manager class no longer expects us to pass in an ID for a unit, but instead just passes in the unit and the list of target units so that we're not having to constantly go back to our manager and ask it to tell us what we were targeting, because when we set these variables, we know what these are supposed to be. So there's no reason to have to do that lookup. Okay, now if Unity doesn't have any bugs, we should test and see if there's any errors. It did find some bugs. Okay, so the error list in Visual Studio was not fully up to date. So this needs to be target. This needs to be get animator. Get component animator. That like that. And then down here, we should just be able to get rid of this function call, rename it to target. That works. Here, instead of getting the unit, we can just pass in the target. This looks fine to me. Should be able to just do attacker dot get abilities. This needs to now expect the targets to be targets. Change the name, and we no longer need to go fetch it. We are just grabbing the game object and we are just grabbing the transform. Seems reasonable. Get rid of the fetch. The next thing to do after we finish changing all of this code will be to go see if we are actually even using getUnitAnywhere anymore. Is it actually even being used? Because it may be able to just be removed. Which would be nice. Okay, we control save all, control shift, and then let's run back into Unity. Let's take a look if any more bugs have cropped up. And then we'll run it and see if we get any runtime errors, which is that the code looks right, but the data that we're passing around could be wrong. Okay. Let's see, maybe double ghost fight? Ooh, there was a problem. Did I misevaluate something on the character loading stuff at the very beginning? It looks like we actually use that index for the spawn locations. Okay, so if that's the case, what we need to do then is we need to have two values. So we do need to reset index back to 0 on every run. Maybe we'll just do it now. Let's make a private variable, which will be an integer, which is load count, which starts at 0. Now, load count will be what we pass in as our ID for each character. So whatever the current count is, that's your current ID that you will have and you will be referenced by. And then this will now use the load count instead. And then the load count will be incremented in the same way the index is, which isn't great. I don't love it because now we're updating two sets of variables, which are kind of doing similar things. But I'm going to say fine. Not the end of the world. Not going to be the most inefficient thing that it'll crash our game forever. This is on load. It's not every frame. Should be okay. All right. Let's see. Let's go back into the ghost one again. Seems reasonable. Seems fine. Problem. We're no longer seeing the golem's abilities. Alright. I couldn't have planned this better if I tried. This lets us go look at some of the code that I wrote for loading in the companion abilities and how companions are loaded in general. So we do see here that when we initialize our team members, we first initialize the we first initialize the team members like we always did before, getting the character model, setting them. But then this second loop here didn't used to exist until I made this change. And what I'm doing here is getting the team member's companion. And on the team manager, we actually load our design data. So this is what happens for the whole team. This isn't in battle. This is like what happens outside of battle. So when we start the game, we say, hey, we're going to initialize a team manager. That team manager is going to have basically the 4 characters that are at the front of the design data. And then we're also going to add companions if this character has a companion ID. And that add companion is actually very similar to the code that we write for adding a character generally, but it just creates that character, defaults it to the back row, says that it's a companion for specific reasons that are kind of hacky, but it's fine. And we set up all its stats and everything. Then when we go into battle, when we go into the actual fight, the loading stuff that we're looking inside of character load, now this team member, which we're getting from the back end, get all team members, we're getting its companion and we're loading up its companion as well. And this initialize will go through and it will do the async load the same way it did before, and it'll go into the unit factory. Once we load the model, we'll pass in that resulting object that we loaded, which is the prefab for the type of look of that character. And then we take the design data that we saved when we said, hey, initialize this thing. And then now we take in its index, which we just changed, and we create that unit. And we then add that unit to the list of units for the character combat. So this has a list of every unit, whether it's a companion or not, but we only add the unit ATB if it's not a companion, because we don't want the companions getting tracked inside of turn order. And that's how this is handling that. So we're only going to have the monsters and the heroes. Well, this is the logic. If it's a hero that is not a companion, then it'll get tracked. But let's take a look at the unit factory. So when we create a unit, doesn't really care whether it's a companion or not. The only thing that we do that really cares whether it's a companion is inside of here, which is where we get into some weirdness, let's say. So in order to do this, I think that a somewhat more objective way to do this might be to have it so that we say, hey, load the team member, and the team member loads up, and then it says, okay, now that you've loaded up, now load the companion inside of that logic. But instead we're loading all of the heroes, and then we're loading all of their companions separately in a different loop. So what I'm having to do to connect the two is I'm saying, hey, for all the units that have been initialized, if this thing had a companion team member, which we can look at here, comes from that team member's companion. If it had a companion set, which the backend sets them together. If it has one, then look through the initialized units and check to see if any of those initialized units have a companion component, and check to see if the companion component of that other one is not null, and then check to see whether or not that initialized unit's combat ID matches the ID of my associate companion. Now, we do run into the same problem where this ID... I see the bug. So originally this initialized ID was a design data ID. And this design data ID, this is what I said when we first made this change, is we need to make sure that we never use this ID anywhere. And somehow I missed this one. It glossed over when I was flipping through the references. This we expected to actually be the ID of the design data. And we expect that there will always be the pairing in the right order, because we have each of these main characters, even if they each have a golem, we expect that we went through the order like this, and then we're going to go through the next list in this same order. So if we had a knight, and then we load up all of these heroes, then we load up a companion, we go into this function and say, hey, I'm adding a companion. Is there anyone initialized who is my friend, right? If we're at this point, we should have initialized all these guys. We'll go back over here and say, hey, this knight is associated with me, so I'm going to set this knight to be my friend. Even if we have 4 knights here, because we do them in this order and then this order, they will match back up. It's a little hacky, but it does work. Now, the bug that we just created was that we said, hey, this combat ID is no longer referencing that design data ID. It's now some value based off of what order this unit was created. So if it was the 4th unit created, then it'll be 3 because we start counting at 0. So first unit would be 0, second unit would be 1, third unit would be 2, and fourth unit would be 4 or 3. But anyways, it's off by 1. You get me. Moving on. So by doing this, we're now saying, hey, is this the character ID we expect, which is going to be companion 1 or main character 1? And it's going to be, no, it's not, because it's not equal to 4. So now they don't match. So we actually do need, for this specific piece of code only, we do need the design data ID. So this is the design ID. Design data ID? Design data ID. It's a little more wordy, but it's a little more clear. And so now we need to not just pass in the combat ID for each of these units when we initialize them. We also need to initialize them with their design data ID as well. These should be lowercase as well. Just naming conventions. Okay. Which is now, it's going to complain because, hey, we're only passing in one ID. So here, this needs to be a combat ID. Again, this should be lowercase. And it will also need, when we add a unit, to add a design data ID. Okay, now this will have design data ID and combat ID. And then this function is used in 2 locations. It's going to be used for the monsters, which the monsters don't need this, it doesn't seem, but they might at some point. So this will need its ID passed in, and then its combat index. So maybe we'll call this combat index just to be a little bit more clear. Just some simple renaming. Same thing here. We'll call this combat index, and then we'll also add data.m character ID. Where is this used to? It's used in a couple places. I think this is another good candidate for a rename. I actually don't think this is the character ID. I think that a better way to describe this specific one is the design data ID, and we'll just make that change across the board. So that when we're updating here, it now says design data ID, and we just have a little bit more clarity. Okay. So, with all that being done, we would now expect this to not use the combat ID, but we say, hey, is another initialized unit equal to the design data ID of what I expect my companion's design data ID to be? And if so, then we're going to set my companion to equal this companion, and I'm going to set the other companion class, which is the unit that's already been initialized, so this will be the hero, companion to unit, which is the companion in this situation. And then we will set the companion component, which is the companion. It's companion. So the companion is companion to be the initialized unit, which is the hero. So hero equals companion. Companion equals hero. And now they're linked to each other. They have a way of talking about who's who. So if we ever have an attack that says targets through both of them, so it's like targets one unit but hits both the companion and the hero, then we can try and make that work because we'll always have a reference to the other one. And then initialize add companion abilities. So for the initialized unit, which is going to be the hero in this situation, because we always load the heroes first, then the companions. So for this initialized unit, we want to add companion abilities, and we're going to pass in this unit, which in this case is the golems, ability IDs. So we set them up the same way, but we pass them in here. And then when we pass them in, we just make sure that we don't add the same ability twice. That's really the main change that we've made in this code. I think that kind of covers most of the companion logic now. So moving right along, we should be able to get back into battle, and we shouldn't have that bug that we had a moment ago where we weren't seeing the abilities. And we weren't seeing the abilities because we weren't finding the associated companion, because the IDs were incorrect, because we were now using a combat ID, but we were expecting a design data ID, which was meaning that we weren't finding our companion, which means we weren't adding our abilities to the list. But now the black magic tab is back. I can perform fire, I can attack, and the correct unit swapped. So if we remember from the beginning, these two were not swapping, but this one was swapping. We also need something to identify who's who, because I do find I get lost a little bit. I know that you can kind of tell from these ability bars, but these will be going away soon. More on that later. So those guys swapped. There's no bugs, but the lighting seemed to get pretty dark after the attack. I think there's still something busted with the highlight lighting, which also doesn't work for these guys. Oh, also, Drixie made those guys. I'm sorry that that took an hour to say. These pieces here are pieces of art that Drixie has brought all the way through. But before I go too much further into that, I think that this is now technically finished. Fetching a unit by unit ID does not work, as it is not a unique ID in combat, because you can have multiple characters with the same ID loaded. May not actually be a huge thing, but I think that the code looks a little bit cleaner now in general, so we can call that done. I'm not going to log any work because me and Drixie are working pretty irregularly. That's maybe not the best. Like, saying it took us a week to do one thing doesn't really tell us much, so I don't think time is really going to be a big factor, considering this is more of a casual project we're going to work on for a very long time, so not logging any time on anything. Okay. We do see here that in this situation, this I believe this was the mage character, the wizard. Actually, because we already had fire, he doesn't have any companion associated abilities, which is kind of interesting. Ideally, the design data just wouldn't create this overlap. Cool. Before we go too much further, I do want to just touch on this, and I wish I had have said it sooner, but there was a lot to cover. I'm surprised this is only an hour. I feel like we've covered a lot of content, but we've covered it briefly, I guess. But if we look at these units, these characters that Drixie has built, there's actually a fair amount of concepting time. There's some concept images in the dev blog, but this went through some iterations until we landed on a final version in which Drixie actually built all of these things fully, because these things are going to animate and move, so we had to actually draw each rock as a full form object. And then we built them in a 2D animation system. This is in one of Unity's packages. It's kind of just base logic now. Hey, it's Amorphous. Welcome to the stream. How's your evening going? Well, I was just saying, and maybe you heard me, but I'll say it again because it really iterates how well this is going. That I kind of managed to explain what I've done off camera over the last few weeks in about an hour broadly, and we've also managed to fix a fairly not hard bug, but a bug that touched a lot of systems. And we've done that all on camera, and I feel like I've explained it fairly well. So feeling pretty good about the stream. If I had to end it, and I'm not ending it, but if I had to end it right now, I feel like we would have successfully done a good update on where we're at on the project. Now, where was it? Oh, I was going to talk about Drixie stuff. So, in doing all that, though, didn't really get a good chance to talk about Drixie's new models. So these are fully made by her, from concept all the way up to these final assets. And we're calling these final assets. This took a lot of time and effort. We may retouch some of these up as her digital skills increase over time, but overall, I'm pretty stoked. I think it looks fantastic. So this is made in program called Krita. That's what she felt comfortable with. She jumped in, she built this. Unity is splitting this up into several different images, but when we actually go into the skinning editor, which is a tool Unity has for actually animating two-dimensional sprites, it gets put back into its original form. This is the form that it was in Krita, and each of these pieces that got separated, so that when they were in this separated form, each of these were a separate layer. And so each of these layers, when you bring them in to Unity as a Photoshop file, because even though Krita is not Photoshop, you can still export the files as Photoshop files. You do have to rename it from a Photoshop like PSB to, or PS, whatever the normal Photoshop file extension is, you have to rename it to PSB, which is like a different type of Photoshop file. But by just renaming the file extension, it just works, that you can bring it into Unity and it knows what to do with it. I don't know why it has to be that file extension. Some Google Forms said so. So then we bring it in here. It recompiles it back into its original form that it looked like. This is what it looks like in Krita, but it separates all the layers out into individual pieces. And then we can look at here and we can actually go, we can't do it in live mode. So let's stop. And we can take a look in here and we can see that this thing actually has a series of different bones. If we move these bones around, we can reset the position, and we can see that as we move the different ones, it moves all the bones under it. We decided to leave this part separate because it was just easier to be able to animate these arms up and down, and the body up and down separately for trying to do animations. We may change that a bit. And then this thing also has some weighting attached to it. So if we look at the bone influences, we can see that the way that we've written, or that we built this model up in particular, each bone only is referencing a specific piece of art. So when one bone moves, it moves all the bones under it, but it's really only moving one image attached to each one, which makes this fairly easy. When we get into characters, we're going to have to do some actual, like, the arm will be one image, but it'll have to distort as the bones move. I may cover some of that stuff in a later video if you guys are interested in seeing some of that. Honestly, me and Drixie are still learning about it ourselves, but that's kind of where we're at with that. And then Drixie is kind of ramping up on the animation sets. The current one, which we've named Diggy Diggy, is just a first pass. Okay, I've given that some due. I've given that some good air. Just wanted to say that. I do think that in the near future, I will want to rip out all of this that is not Drixie's art. So like if this came from the Unity Asset Store, or if this came from UI Elements or whatever, I think I want to replace all of it with placeholder, and then we'll slowly bring in more of Drixie's stuff over time. Because I think that it'll be better if we have it blank and we build up that canvas. So in the next couple streams, you may see that I've done that work off camera. Cool. So we got this working. So now characters swap when we do a fire attack. They swap positions. We can do this with each of our characters. This one swapped. Then it was the wizard. Oh no, it's the barbarian that's going. Oh, interesting. The barbarian is the one who has all the magic attacks. We can do each of these. Okay, and then now we're back to the archer, which is up here. And then if we do an attack with the archer, we'll see that the archer swaps back to front. Okay, that all seems to be working. We get to the battle. We gain some experience. Units gain levels. All good and great. I think one thing that I haven't done, which I'm going to actually throw in the backlog now before I forget about it, is that we haven't taken into account the companions. We're going to make a new task, which will be assigned to me, and it will be probably an off-camera task. We're going to do for the combat mechanics, heroes and companions, and we're going to leave this in the backlog. We're going to say that the companions are, I was going to say aren't, but we should say what they are or what we're doing. Companions need to have experience. distributed to them. And currently only heroes are gaining XP at the end of battles. Okay. There may be a design decision to not have companions level up. I'm still working through what exactly this companion hero relationship concept is, but for the sake of keeping track of stuff, we should have it logged somewhere just so that I don't lose it. Cool. So we did the thing. We moved the bug to complete. What do we want to do now? Let's go back to the August sprint and look at some of the things that we can try and accomplish. We do have another bug, which is that enemy AI targeting selection does not account for death states. I think this is also kind of true in general for the units. You can target dead enemies as well. I'm not so concerned about that because I have plans to kind of change around some of the targeting stuff a little bit in the UI selection in general. But I don't think I want to tackle this bug. I also want to make the game turn-based. I think the more I play with this stuff, the more I want to make my combat more puzzle-based. And I think that being turn-based and not ATB system will allow us to have a little bit more control over the flow of combat and allow more decisions to be made. But what kind of decisions, Tolly? What are the decisions that I will be making in combat? Well, I'm glad you asked. So one of the things that I really want to try with this companion system is this idea of elements. This is something that I'm partly inspired from Gloomhaven. I've played a lot of Gloomhaven, and Gloomhaven has this idea that you can build up elements and then they wane over time, and you can kind of chain them into using more powerful attacks, doing bigger hits, doing cooler things. But you can still do the base ability, but it's cooler if you have more elements. So I kind of want to play with something similar, and I want to see if we can kind of do something in conjunction with this companion hero system. So I want to do an elemental manager first off. I want to have something that allows me to control the elements in a battlefield. And I want to be able to have it so that the battlefield elements are global. It's not an element that you build up personally, but an element that is in the field. If you have... Oh, thanks for watching, Amorphous. See you later. If you have the character do an attack, I would like to have that ability that they do potentially generate an element. So we have the rock golem, for example, right now. He might have abilities that generate earth energy. And then when he builds up that earth energy, that would go globally to the element manager. But I also want to have some abilities require it should be consume different elements. So if I go into a battle, I could have my earth guy do an attack. It generates an element of earth, but because it's a global element of earth, it means that potentially the enemy might have an ability that could consume that earth and do a big attack on me. So kind of learning some of the ins and outs of that. And again, I think turn-based will allow for that to be a little bit more controllable. If I know that, oh, I'm going to do an attack that will generate fire, and then another character will go that I know can use fire, then I can try and make that work. But maybe I shouldn't risk it if the enemy is going to go before me. You start to make some puzzle-y type decisions. There's some design, there's some choice. And so I think that stuff could be really cool. So I want it to be turn-based, but I think for today, let's see if we can get the elemental manager up and running. These are all things I'd like to do on stream. This isn't a commitment, by the way. This tag is just more for my own personal mindset and understanding. It might be that I do allow navigation of battle UI with keys so that it's more controller support and keyboard support than mouse support. That might be something I end up doing off camera. Only time will tell. But these are things that I think could make for interesting content. Element manager. Did I write a description in here? A manager to keep track of the current levels of the elements. Sounds reasonable. Let's go make one. Let's go into Unity. Let's do... Where do we keep our managers currently? Well, we have our state managers. We also have our combat managers. This thing currently handles victory and everything else. Let's go in here and make a new one. Let's do element manager. I think we need to switch over to the battle scene because we're going to have to make some modifications. This event select screen is great for being able to run battles, but if we're actually modifying the battle, then it makes sense to be in the combat scene. I think you can actually have both loaded. I think I could drag both into the scene, but I'm not sure exactly how that would operate, so I'm just not going to risk it. Managers. We need a new one. We're going to add a new object. New object for every manager, so it's clear, so that there aren't managers stacked on managers. Have I already broken that rule yet? Nope. So far, every manager has its own object, so we can see it in the hierarchy. There's nothing hidden right now. So element manager. And then we will name it as such. And then we're going to need to grab the singleton probably. Singleton property. So if we look at victory manager, that's probably pretty straightforward, right? What does this thing do? Yeah, it's got basically nothing in it. Seems like a good one to look at. We're going to want to grab this concept of singleton. Was there anything else that a singleton needs off the base? Nope, this all seems very specific to the battle winning. Don't need this logic anymore because we're actually awarding experience through the experience manager. I do need to update this value to be based off the encounter. There's a bunch of work that needs to be done. Should I go write it? Should I go write it right now so I don't forget about it again? No, we'll leave it. I'll find it again eventually. But basically right now when we gave experience, it's just a flat 1,000 every single time. I think this transition is handled somewhere else too now. And this transition start isn't really a transition anymore. It's just making sure that we don't award it multiple times. Honestly, this whole section could use a refactor. We're just going to add a to-do. This needs a refactor. Maybe tomorrow I'll go through and check all these to-dos and actually try and create tasks for them. Back to the element manager. So, what does this thing need? Well, it's going to need a list of the elements, I would think. How's stats do this? Stats does something cool, doesn't it? This has a list of integers based off of the stats and the data. Could we copy this as a way of doing this? Could we say, hey, we're going to have this information, but instead of stats, we're going to need elements. Do we have a section for enums right now? I'm also planning on upgrading my computer soon because the amount of time that it takes to load some of these scripts when we go back in Unity feels slow to me. Feels slow. For some of you who have been with me a long time, you might know, or maybe it's not entirely obvious because I've never actually said it aloud, I've never upgraded my computer. I got my computer right when we started this YouTube channel. Well, I've upgraded parts, but I'm using the same motherboard and processor since 2010. This computer is 10 years old and it has held up like a trooper over the years. But when we get into some dev stuff, it's not holding up anymore. Games, it's fine. You can turn the settings down. We play at 720 most of the time anyways because it's just easier to stream. But here, even when I'm working on my own, not on camera, it's not worth it. Need something better. Need a better processor. I've upgraded the graphics card as far as I can go, upgraded the RAM, but the processor from 10 years ago, it is what it is, and I just need to move on. But hopefully that'll come soon. Mini tirade ramble over. I was looking for a spot to put a new enum. That's what we were doing. So we have the script section. Common? Maybe it goes in common. Most of the gameplay stuff is currently inside of the Liquid Fire blog section, which is most of the scripts that come from that tutorial, which is nice for organization sake, but it's going to get slightly confusing because even now I've added rows, which wasn't really a thing before. So this is where our enums are. I might want to restructure some of the folder structure as we continue forward. For now, let's continue to add more enums in here. This will be not fire, that's the first element, but this will be elements. Is elements confusing though? Because technically you can have elements in an array. So do we want to have are, these are like the elements: fire, wind, water, earth, blah, blah, blah. But elements can have other connotations in code. Could say elemental energies. Or we can just call it elements. It's weird to have an enum that would be elements of an array. So let's assume that common sense says this is elements as in the elements, the energies, the powers. And this is going to be an enum. It's not going to be a mono behavior. It's going to just be an enum. And this enum will be similar to stats. Stupid Unity. We'll go this way. Stats. This is taking too long. Stat types. Yep. Seems reasonable. Nah, we don't need to copy that. I'm making myself more work by trying to copy paste when I could just write. Say there's fire, earth, ice, lightning. Cool. These are the elements. We may add more, we may add less, but that's why we're writing the code this way, so that instead of it being a set value, it instead is just the elements. Okay. Now, in the same way that we have stats, this is honestly going to work very similar, I think. This just gets... Do we actually want to just straight grab the same way that a stats are handled for a unit, but instead we just, you know what? I think I do. I think that the way that we handle, we need count. I think the same way that we handle stats is how we'll handle the units. Because there might be something that we might want to have modify it. The whole point of the way that this stats class was built in the Liquid Fire blogs, the real thing that if you go read those blog posts that he talks about, is the fact that this gives us flexibility that in like a JRPG, if you're going to have a perform an attack, you might want to notify that you're changing an attack speed or attack value or a defense value. And then you say, hey, I'm trying to get this value, or I'm trying to set this value. And you might have armor or weapons that want to know about that. And so you say, hey, I'm modifying this, and something can go, I give a 5% bonus. Please increase it by this amount. That's the kind of idea here. And I don't know if I'll use that for the elemental manager, but might. And so if I might as well make the changes to support it. And the idea would be, we could have it so that we have something that sets the value of fire globally and say, hey, I'm going to make fire 1. But we can have things that will listen for that and go, actually, for this boss battle, the boss makes it so that fire cannot be increased. Fire is always 0. It's a special property of the boss. Maybe you can break him in order to kind of get rid of that property or something. And he's weak to fire attacks. There's cool things you can do there. Weird one-off scenarios. It will require way more engineering and time and design than that. But let's say that that neat idea is a cool thing. Then for that boss, we might want to add something that says, hey, anytime elements get modified, I want to listen for that. And I want to say, hey, if you're increasing fire, nope, it's 0. So that way the element doesn't actually get incremented. Cool, cool. So this all looks to work. I do think I want to rename type here to element. So I think I can do my cool rename trick, element. Makes refactoring a little bit easier. So it's just the element. Same here. And same here. Okay. seems reasonable. Just reading through this to make sure this makes sense. Yep. Yeah, all of this seems fine. Sorry, just trying to make sure I'm reading the code and fully understanding it. It's been a while since I've looked at the stats. Okay. Yeah, this all seems reasonable. We'll have to look at specifically something like rank in order to see how we'll actually listen for the elements in order to prevent it. So stats.will change. So something will have to have a reference to elementmanager.instance.will change and then add an observer. Yeah, that looks great. Okay, cool. So we may never use this stuff, but I think it's really cool to have it just already integrated. This seems like a great way to build this thing. I think that's it. This is a bug. We need to make sure that it's a singleton of the right type. So I think we built an element manager that will have a list of each of the elements that we can modify and increment its value. And there are 4 of them. I'm willing to call that in test. I mean, it's basically it. There's not much more to it. That was actually a fairly straightforward thing. So next, let's see. By doing that, we've unlocked the ability to add abilities. I have some dependencies on some of these things. Add ability generating elements. Is that really required in order to work on the UI side of it? It's really not, actually. I think I was getting a little overzealous with some of my dependencies when I did this. I think that we can do the UI, and I think the UI is a more natural step. We can debug add elements to things. Let's get some UI to actually track what's happening. And then we can look at adding the abilities and setting up the abilities to consume. Okay. One thing we didn't look at on the elemental manager was, is there a limit? Can I go too high? Which could be handled by the will notify change. We could have a min-max value associated. Okay. I think there's a modifier that already exists for that. Let's get that loading, and while it's loading, let's take a think. So we want to do this. I do think it makes sense to add via abilities before we have some abilities consuming it, but let's try and just build a simple UI just to represent what the elemental count is currently at. What does our UI currently look like? That's under canvas, correct? Yes, that's this thing. Where do we want to put this? I don't love any of this UI. I'm probably going to rip it all up soon. In the near future. But for the time being, let's just assume that we can add a UI panel. Let's not make it the entire screen. Let's make it the top left-hand corner. Make it dark. Gray is probably fine, and we'll just kill the transparency. We are quite literally gray boxing the UI. Okay, so then this thing will have probably an image. That image will need to take up 1/4 of this space right now. How big is this panel? 960? 960 is not correct. There's the width value, 320. So 320 divided by 5, let's say. Oh, works out to 64. Nice. So then let's do 64, and then let's make... Let's make this a content layout, horizontal layout group. Don't force expand children. Okay, that works. Let's give it some top padding. 5, 10, 15. 15 seems okay. Let's give it some padding or some spacing. 5. So we said 64 was the value. 64 divided by 5 is my next question. I'm just going to do the math directly in here. About 12.8. So let's say there's about 12 spacing in between each of these. Okay, so we should be able to make 4 of them like so. And then we can give it some left padding to kind of get it a little bit closer to alignment. Okay, 15, 15, 12. Cool, and then let's just bring this up a little bit so it looks a little bit more even. Don't know why I said it that way. Element 1. Ideally, considering this is potentially a dynamic amount of elements, we may eventually want this to be loaded on run. So instead of hard building 4 of these things, in the same way that we built a hard number down here, we really should be building something that dynamically spawns some prefabs based off of the data, in the same way that we did in the debug selection screen. But I'm still not positive if I love the way that that turned out, so I'm going to continue to just hard code these for the time being. Again, we're gray boxing stuff. I'm just trying to get something up and running. It does not need to be perfect. For this element, let's say this is fire. That seems fire-esque. Let's do a value of 0. Let's make this thing the size of the panel. And we'll do center, center for the padding. Okay. Realistically should have done that for each of these before I did all that copy and pasting. Double clicking zooms. Okay. Again, probably should have renamed these things. Element. I'm getting ahead of myself with the like making 4 copies part. Okay, now each of these, we have fire, we have earth, so that can be a bit of a brown tone. I guess our golem is kind of more of a gray right now. So might want to do something a little bit off from the background gray. Does that pop enough? Not really. That works. Again, gray box, not too concerned about perfect stylings. Ice, so that's going to be a cool blue probably. And then lightning, which I'm thinking is going to be kind of in the yellowish range. It's more of a gold, isn't it? That's some color choices. Okay. Now, each of these values should reflect the current value in the element manager. So let's build a simple UI script that reflects that. We have a UI folder, which is a hodgepodge of random scripts. Element display. Okay. Honestly, these colors should be coming from this script as well. Really just beating myself down here about how I'm making somewhat bad code. Also, I know this is from a while back now, but I still have chat up on the side. I want to point out that Amorphous has been subbed for 33 months. What the heck? Okay, let's do element display. Let's add this to the element. Might need the update, we'll see. Gonna need the text mesh Pro using, was it TM Pro? I think it's just that. And then text mesh Pro UI text. Cool. Element manager dot instance dot. How were those stats done again? Let's go back and take a look at rank, because I think we can do the same thing here on did change. So on did change, we want to do the same thing. This observer on experience did change, which looks like this. Is this how the syntax goes together? Elements. And then this, actually, this should be a public elements. Element to display. And we should be able to set this from the UI. Okay. Now, we want to do on destroy as well. On destroy. Actually, can we grab this all from... It's on enable and disable. Maybe we should be doing it the same way. So this is the on enable. And then we want the remove side here, which should be the same parameter pass-ins. Okay, so then we shouldn't need a start. I don't know if on enable and disable makes sense for a UI element, but we'll try it. This doesn't need to be on experience did change. This is on element did change. Okay. I shouldn't have deleted the contents. I should have just commented it out because I need to see. This just gets the stats, which we can do the same thing. Elements dot element manager dot instance, and then whatever element I'm trying to display has changed. This is what's going to happen is anytime the element manager's display value changes, this will also get updated, so the UI will just know to update itself on this call. instead of having to check constantly to see whether or not the value is different. This is working out well. Is this all I need to do? Whenever the element that I'm set to display changes, update my text appropriately to be whatever that value is. I think this simple bit of code should just work for now. Again, I think it would be nice if instead of having the colors pre-built here, it'd be nice if the element manager maybe held these colors. That way, if we had different particle effects we wanted to tint or something, or different UI, maybe the different elements need to have these colors as well. It should probably be stored in the element manager instead of just hard coded into these images. But the second we need to use this color a second time, that's what we'll do. For the time being, I think this is fine. So this will reference its version of text, and this one is fire. This needs the component element display. This is earth, and it needs its text. Yeah, these could totally be generated. There's no reason I have to hard build them, other than it's slightly faster. Ice, element display, lightning, and text. Okay, so now however elements get updated throughout the process of this game, it should update here. What's a real easy way to do that? To test. Could we write a simple button press? That is blurry, isn't it? This is why we use TextMesh Pro. Scale it to be the same size. Make it actually smaller. Make it centered. Make it dark. And it's cleaner. Okay. This object is underneath a layout, so it needs to ignore UI layout element. Ignore layout, so it doesn't actually get... I couldn't move it because it was being controlled. Okay, now, if we add on click element manager, for the sake of testing, we can add a simple increment function to this. This isn't how we'd actually do it in code, but for a button press, a debug button press, we'll just add a simple function that increases... Can I say elements? Can I pass in an element into this thing? And then can I do this element needs a value to return, which will be void plus plus. Does this work? If it does, then we can add a button for each one. I expect there to be some sort of input parameter here, but I don't know if they support that. Element manager. I'm not seeing it, so it doesn't look like it does. Nope. We just need to test. Honestly, we don't even really need to test. We could just move right on to actually doing the next part, but this is fine. I feel like Unity does have some support for this. And now I'm going to be slightly stubborn and figure it out. If I pass in an integer and not a custom enum, does Unity give me a value that I can set? I feel like it should. Yes, it does. There it is. Okay, this one will be 3, 2, and 1. We don't have a decrease right now, but I don't really care. And through the magic of code, yeah, we'll want to have a limiting number on how high you can get an element. Like maybe like 4 or 5 seems reasonable to me. It also means that we might want to have some abilities that just consume however much there is, and they're more powerful the more element there is in the field. But that's an element manager. It's handling some stats, some numbers basically. I'll leave the pluses there for now, but it proves its point. Ability adding. That's really the next part. So we have the basic UI. That is working, technically. Add abilities generating elements. Oh, goodness. Let us see. So we're going to have to take a look at our design data. The abilities do have their own section with all of this data, and most of it we're not using. There is an element type, which I don't think we read in right now. There's also status effects, which we don't have. Many things to do still. We don't have wind, and we don't have light. Let's say that each of the companions are different. Let's say they all use the golem look, but let's say that there is 2, there is 3, and there is 4. And then this can be fire. This can be ice, and this can be lightning. Okay. They will all use the same model, but we will have fire be associated with this one. I don't think it really matters, to be honest. These aren't final things in any way, but we're just going to toss them in randomly like that. Okay, now they will all have the same stats, but we will have the thunder attack be used by the lightning one, then ice fire. So now we need ice one, fire, and then we'll need earth on top. Okay, cool. So now we have 4 companions tied to the 4 characters, and each of them are producing a different element. So then if we go look in here, we have this element type. What is the last thing we parse in from the design data on the element side, or on the abilities, I should say? Design data. We actually want to look at the parser. Ability parser. So when it parses in the fields, the last thing it gets in is element 5, which is the animation. Here. So then 6, 7, 8. Row 8 is the element. So let's try parsing in that element. Is that right? Is that what I just said? This is 5, 6, 7, 8. That is correct. Let's assume right now that you can only produce 1 point per attack. Straight flat. So that should come in. We are going to need a new value for this, which will be, I think the enum is fine. I don't think it needs to be anything silly. This will need to be more complicated because abilities will also need to consume elements. So right now we just have 1 array in, and this is just going to generate, but let's one step at a time. So ability can now have an element in its design data, and we might want to have that ability come in here. We are going to want to parse it in to the enum. Do we have anywhere yet in this project where we do that? Do any of our other parsers do an enum conversion, or is it literally faster to do enum unity convert string to enum? Unity answer, your enum, system enum parse blah blah blah, your string. Cool, that's what I want. Dump that here. My string is this. My element is elements. And I don't need system. And then I need elements here. Now, this works as long as the names are identical. So we need these names to be fire, ice, earth, lightning, which I don't think they are. Fire, ice, earth, lightning. I believe this is also going to be case sensitive. So let's just double check. That all seems fine. Okay. So we're going to have to download the design data. So we're going to download as TSV. And we're going to save over our old abilities. Like so. Then we should be able to do the tools, which is our tools. Because I like just putting the in front of everything if no one's figured that out yet. The Tolly, the JRPG, the tools. Ability parse. Invalid parse. Enum result is failure. My fancy code didn't work. It's one of the first times we've written something that hasn't really run yet this evening. Although we did a lot of explanation, not a lot of code writing. What code writing we did was more renaming and reordering. I guess to be fair on myself, I did have to Google it. It's something I didn't have offhand as a reference. Alright, so we're debugging. Let's run... Oh, that's not what I want. I want to do ability parse. Element 8 is, in this situation, attack. No. Nothing. It doesn't like parsing to nothing. That's the problem. So if that was the oversight, string dot is null or empty, pass in the string value. Then we will do ability equals, oh, we kind of need to have a none version, don't we? Kind of need a null. Stick it at the bottom, I guess. See if that makes sense. Okay. If it's empty, set it to empty. Maybe none is a better word for this. Element? None. Yeah. Okay, so now we can set this element. So, animation. This is when we do setting the animation resolve effect. So when we resolve the ability, the unit will take damage on enter, blah, blah, blah. We also want to do the same way that we grab design data from the ability, get the animation. In the same line of code, we also want to do on enter of the resolve, we want to grab the element. And I think we want to just do element manager dot instance of this element type plus plus. I think we want to do plus plus element. I think that's better practice. Honestly, best practice right now is going to be actually plus equal 1, because I think at some point we might want this value to not just be 1. We might want the design data to dictate an amount to increase. Okay. Cool. We also need the characters, don't we? We modified the ability sheet, but we also technically modified the character sheet. So we want to do here, download TSV, overload or overwrite the characters. Hopefully this doesn't break everything. Tools. Did that work? Yeah, it worked. Okay, looks like the new companions are there. And looks like these have elements set to them. I'm not super happy about none being at the top. We might want to give none a set value of like 10. And then we'll want to reevaluate this. 10 implies that we can have... 10 would be... I'm trying to give ourselves space to have as many elements as we want, and 10 limits us to 9 elements or 8 elements. So I think I'll just make it 100. Just have none set to a specific value. Okay, and then let's re-import the abilities again so that that value is set to 100, except for the couple spots where it's set to 1, 3, 2, etc. Okay. Cool, cool, cool. So if we run the game, use thunder. Thunder went up by 1. Use earth. Earth went up by 1. Use ice. Ice went up by 1. This mage has all of them, so it's not going to be the companion doing it. But it'll still be fire. Cool. Works. So then the next step would be getting getting the abilities consuming. So we kind of have this up and running now. That seems functional. I think there's a little bit of work around maybe having the option to increment more than 1. But now there's the concept of elements requiring and or consuming. I think I would like the idea for some abilities to be optional consumes. Like you can still use the attack like a heal, but it's more powerful if you have earth magic in the realm. Or a fire attack, but it does extra damage if you have fire elements. So I don't think this is a straight, it requires 2 to cast, and you can't do it until you have 2. And if you have 2, then you can do it. I still think that might be a reasonable type of component, but I don't think that's necessarily exactly what I want. I think I might want some variety. The abilities that our characters have, which if we take a look at the character pool, and I believe we take a look at a CUI, we want to look at the actual main entities. So if we look at the characters, and we go down to one of these knights, right now the unit's abilities, I believe, are a hidden list inside of unit, which we don't see here because it's not serialized. So even in debug mode, it can't be seen. But if we look here, the abilities are just a list of ability infos. And the ability info just says whether this is a companion ability, what unit it's tied to, and what ability ID it has. I think I want to take this one offline. I think the consuming part isn't, well, we're at about 2 hours, almost dead on actually, 1 minute 59. I think I want to take this part offline. I think this is going to be pretty complicated. We'll probably talk a little bit about how it ended up going in the next stream, but either I'm going to need to add some very specific logic types into the ability info, like a bunch of data sets to say, hey, this also, well, I don't know if it would be in the ability info. It might be in the actual design data for the ability, because we could have the ability ID and then just reference the design data the same way that we're currently doing on the resolve effect. So when we say, hey, we grab the element, we can have more values in here per se that says, hey, this thing is of type consume element and it has this value and it is mandatory. Like we could add some types of parameters like that to it. The other option is going back to Liquid Fire blogs, because there was a way in doing abilities in that blog posts, in the blog post that this stuff originally comes from, a lot of the base stuff that I'm working with, in which he had some really smart stuff with ability range, ability effect, and abilities were essentially objects in the same way that characters are. So you could have an ability damage effect. This says what happens when the ability goes off. There's inflict, there's status effect. I think we still have some of this logic, but I think we boiled it down to its basis form. I think we did that for simplicity as we kind of got everything up and running. The abilities still have this attack value. So we are still generating the abilities. So this is an ability, it has physical power, it's of type attack, default effect. Default effect target, which says whether or not something can be a target. Are we even using this? We aren't. Some of this should be being used. I see. We pass around the ability ID all over the place, but then just use the name. Oh, this is not my finest moment. Not sure when that comment's from, but hey, Zaxer on YouTube. Sorry I didn't see that sooner. So I don't love this, because this assumes that if we have two abilities with the same name, it doesn't work. Ideally, it should be using the ID. But we're using the name. This ability could have an ID, though. This ability comes from this base class. So we could add a thing underneath ability, which is the ID, instead of just using the name value, so that we can find the correct one. Or instead of using the ID in general, we probably could be just passing around this gets all the abilities under the component and then performs one based off of the design data name that matches. Yeah, this should be driven by an ID or some unique identifier, not just the name. So this is this should not use name. To do change to use unique ID instead of name, which could be the same for multiple abilities. We could have we could have like 30 different attacks, but they might all be different depending on who's using that attack. And maybe that's not a great thing, but I mean, they might all be different attacks and they might all have different data. But I think at its root core, what I was going to get at is in the same way that when we look at an ability here, I didn't think we were already loading them. So this is actually kind of good that we're still actually loading up these abilities here. I don't know if this is the best spot to have them, but we load up them here. And we could have it so that inside of Earth, we say, hey, this Earth one has another element to it that when we generate this ability, it could have a generate fire. And when we call perform, right now we're calling on the resolve effect, we're calling here to increment the value. Probably shouldn't be here. It should be tied directly to the ability. So when we call perform, it will attempt to perform the attack, and then effect dot apply of the base ability effect. How does something in this system work again with status effects? Because that's basically what we need. We need something that deals damage. Hit, affect target. I think you just add another one. Status name and duration. I'm pretty sure that this system was built around the idea that you could just add as many effects as you wanted. But how does this account for that? I didn't see any... Oh, transform.children count. Base ability effect. So it goes under these children's... This is a base effect. So when we call perform, we go through all of the game objects. Oh, each one needs to be a different child. That's how this works again. That's the setup for this. Is that we wouldn't have damage. We would have another section under here, and we create another object, which the factory should be in charge of, which is add element. And this add element would need to have... This is for status effects, but you would have something similar. We'd need to create a new one, which is apply element effect. And then can perform would need something similar. Magic cost. This is exactly what we're talking about. So we can't perform this attack unless the magic cost is met. In the same way, we might want to say, hey, you can't perform this ability unless the element cost is met. Same idea. Just instead of checking stats, we'd be checking the element manager. Yeah, I think I'm going to undo what I did. I think that what we did was a base way of adding elements to an ability, but I don't think it's the right way. I think off camera, what I'm going to end up doing, and then I'll talk about in the next stream, I think, because I think I'm done for now. But I think what we want to do is we want to add some new ability types, and we want to be able to go into the unit factory, and when we generate these abilities, instead of just having this base version of damage where we're just adding damage and we're adding these base ability effects to it, we're going to want to also check to say, hey, does this thing have an element effect to it? Does it add elements? Okay, well then we're going to want to add a new game object, which is add element, and we're going to want to add our new effect class. There'll be a hit type, there'll be a default effect target, and there'll be an ability effect. And we'll want to do these. And then we'll also want to add a new section as well for another one that you might add to an ability, which is consuming, and also mandatory versus optional. We'll need to figure out how that works. But I'll leave that for off camera figuring out. I think that's going to be a lot of me going think. And eventually getting to it. But it'll probably be a 5-minute start of 5 minutes in the start of the next stream of just going, this is how we did it. It's like this. But I think it's going to require some thought process. But we got the elemental manager stuff set up, and we can increment these, and we've got a little bit of a UI to show us, and we have proof of concept shown that we can kind of apply this ability from somewhere. But I think there's a better way to do it yet. And then next time we'll hopefully have consuming up and running too. I think we're going to call it here though. This all seemed fairly reasonable. Got through a good 2-hour chunk, got a lot of productivity in, kind of got cleared out quite a bit of stuff. Got a lot of stuff kind of in a good solid in progress state, or at least I know what I'm doing. And then next time we come back for some streaming, probably try and tackle one of these. I might tackle turn-based off camera as well. I think this one might require a lot of thought process as well to get right. But there will always be more new things. There's even I might want to do a stream day of just design data. Maybe get things close off camera, get the numbers in the kind of ballpark, and then just spend a day twiddling and tweaking and trying to get numbers to exactly the right values so that combat feels a little bit interesting. Maybe reduce it down to just one hero with one companion and have a couple abilities that make for some interesting puzzles. Ideas, thoughts. For now, though, we're going to call it here. And this is going to be Tolhi signing out for now. Later, guys. Thanks for watching.